I'm one of a kind, and something created me. No, someone created me. And that someone made me for a reason. Even though it's clear the past years have been treason, I still sense this drawing, this calling, that even in the midst of my falling, there was someone who died to pick me up, someone who rose to fix me up, someone who's coming back to lift me up. And that someone is Jesus. See, God made me for a purpose, and when I delight in Him, it's brought to the surface.
Friends, this one quote came to mind the other day. History does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. This is a quote from Mark Twain. It came to mind after I heard Pastor Johnson's sermon last week. You know, the one where he compared me to Samson? He had a lot of good other points in his sermon. And one of those points, I think, was that history does kind of repeat itself, but it's not repeating itself like a song that's stuck on repeat, but like a song that brings back familiar themes. We see that in the pages of history, and we see that as we look through Scripture. He shared with us Judges and that cycle that kept happening in the book of Judges, how the people, they would sin against God, and they would then have enemies come in, and then they would cry out to the Lord, and then the Lord would send a judge and help them, and then they would have time of peace, and then they'd sin again. It's in that theme that I could recognize things from my own life. Times where I recognize my own sins, but don't really want to confront them until I feel the consequence of them. And that's when God comes through and He assures me I am forgiven and I have peace. There is themes that come through history and that comes through our own lives. And I think that is definitely the value of a sermon series like we're doing, in which we go back and look at some of those words of wisdom through the lives of these people who've been recorded centuries ago by our God. These words that are living and active. I love this sermon series that we're going through. Honestly, it is powerful. But to really understand this history, we also got to understand the timeline that's happening. So please imagine, if you will, a timeline in the front of the church today. That the baptismal font that is way over there, that would be the ark and Noah's flood. And then where I'm sitting would be 2017. About halfway in between there, roughly, would be Jesus and what He did. Christmas, Easter, His resurrection. That's about halfway in a timeline. And then if you were to look between when Jesus was here in the flesh and when the Ark of the Covenant, and Noah and the flood, halfway in between there was Judges, what we talked about last week. And 50 years later was the period of Kings, which we're talking about today. See, the people of God, they wanted to be like everybody else. They wanted their own king. And so God gave them Saul, who was a good king for a while. But he made some decisions away from the Lord, and, well, as he wandered away from the Lord, finally the Lord chose someone else to be king, King David. As a 15-year-old, in our society, he wouldn't even have his license yet. He was anointed to be king over all of Israel, but he wasn't put in power yet. You see, he needed to learn through life's experiences. God allowed him, after being anointed, to find his way into the palace and work for King Saul, playing the lyre, which is a type of a harp, to soothe Saul's issues that he was having. And it was in that location where he had been moved from being a normal shepherd to being a palace helper that he was able to confront a Goliath of a man and win. And then God used that situation to throw him into Saul's army, to become a general, to become powerful in leading God's people, to become victorious. And everybody took notice. As David kept winning battle after battle, the people said, Saul has slain the thousands, but David his tens of thousands. And that's where a transition happened in this period of the kings. Saul had joy with David at the beginning, but then that changed, and it changed into jealousy, and that changed into anger, and that changed into hatred. And finally, Saul wanted to kill David, and David ran for his life. He ran all over the place. As you see in this map, he ran all over Judea, all over Israel, running for his life in this game of cat and mouse, running away from Saul, running with about 600 of his own men, happened for about 10 years. And as he was running, he depended upon the generosity of other people. As he was running, he was kind of like Robin Hood with his band of merry men. That's about the time frame that we pick up 1 Samuel 25 today. So I invite you to open your Bibles to that. 1 Samuel 25, your pew Bibles, or maybe your smartphone, you got the Bible app, YouVersion. 1 Samuel 25. And we see that David is approaching a family looking for help. It says there in 1 Samuel 25, verse 1, a certain man in Moab who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. He was a Calebite. Interesting couple in how they're described. Abigail was beautiful, was intelligent, literally of much wisdom, literally of fine features. She has this beauty that's outward, but it's also inward in her wisdom, and also, as we see later in this chapter, in her faith in the true God. Contrast that to her husband, Nabal. Nabal, he's surly and he's mean. Surly and mean, that's not a compliment. Surly is like a terror, like something that's disastrous. You could describe a nasty hurricane as being surly, destructive. And he was mean. He would do evil in his common business practices. Not a good guy. And it seems he was living out what his name meant. His name, Nabal, means a fool. Can you imagine what his parents were thinking? He looks like a fool. Don't name your child Nabal. But unfortunately, he did live that out in his life. He certainly married up, but he was rich and also spiritually bankrupt. Well, Jesus had once said, as we read in Luke chapter 6, it's from the overflow of your heart that your mouth speaks. I bring that up today because as we look at this historical account and we look at Nabal and Abigail and David, we're going to see how that is very true in their life and ours. Because what comes out of our mouth, what comes out with our actions and with our hands, it doesn't start there, it starts in here. Now, before we get into this story and we see how that all plays out, I just got to also make a note on what I just read, that it was the time of shearing sheep. This is very significant. David knew as a shepherd boy that this would be a very good time to approach Nabal to get some help. This would be the equivalent of Thanksgiving in our culture. Everybody would be happy. They would be bringing in what they had been waiting for all season. They would be experiencing wealth and prosperity. What better time to ask for help from Nabal? But as he sent these humble men to visit with Nabal and to ask for help, well, you hear how he responds in verse 10. Nabal answered David's servants who were looking for help. Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where? Did you hear? Did you hear in Nabal's voice what was actually happening in his heart? That he was surly and that he was mean? You heard that when he talked. He put down David, even though he was certainly very popular and he knew who he was. He put him down, and then he focused on himself. And you hear that in his words where he says, how should I take my bread and water, the meat that I have slaughtered for my shearers, and give it to you who I don't even know? It's kind of like a 2-year-old sitting on a pile of toys, and another 2-year-old comes over and would like to just borrow one. that 2-year-old yells out, "Mine!" That's the kind of attitude we see in Nabal's life. It's overflowing from what's coming out of his heart. Well, David didn't handle that news very well. When those soldiers of his came back and they reported on what Nabal had said, they're furious. He was furious. He said, "Strap on your swords, but pretty much lock and load. It's go time. We're going to demolish Nabal and his household and everything that he owns." Now, to be honest, David definitely overreacted. And you can see an overflow of his heart as well. Just judging by his quick jump to action and his anger and his frustration, you see that inside his heart, he's scared. He needs to provide for his troops. In his heart, maybe there's even a little bit of pride, because he knows he's going to be king, and how dare this nobleman not give tribute. So he's ready to take action. But thankfully, some of those servants heard what was happening, and they reported to Abigail. They told her, "Night and day, David's troops were a wall around us the whole time that we were herding our sheep near them. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him." You know, God has called men to step up and to be shepherd leaders in their family, being aware of what the family has as needs, making sure that they're cared for with physical and spiritual needs. And when that doesn't happen, in the case of Nabal, the whole household suffers. The wife suffers, the children suffer, even the servants that they have in their area suffer. Unfortunately, the same is true in our day. God has called us men to step up. But thankful for this situation, Abigail was on her guard. And she was truly wise. And she was truly confident. And she springs to action. As we jump ahead, she took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs, which is about 60 pounds of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisin, 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on a donkey. Then she told her servants, "Go on ahead, I'll follow you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. This was no small task. They didn't have microwaves or stoves or running water. Not the stoves that have electricity or the stoves that are run off of natural gas. This was a lot of work to prepare all this, even if she did have servants helping her. If you wanted a delicious goat, you had to go chase that goat down. But you can tell by the overflow in her actions what's going on in her heart. Deeply, tenderly, she cared for her family. Deeply, tenderly, she knew what needed to be done. She trusted her Lord, and she took action. She is certainly a godly woman. And she took those supplies to David, and then humbly bows her head into the dust before him and says this, in verse 25, "Please pay no attention, my lord, to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. And as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my lord sent. Please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my lord, because you fight the Lord's battles, and no wrongdoings will be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away from the pocket of a sling." Kind of a hint there at David and Goliath. Verse 30, "When the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing that he's promised concerning him and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord your God has brought my Lord success, remember your servant." So Abigail diffuses David with her offerings, with this huge amount of food that she brings to him, but also in her actions. She's a noble woman, and yet she bows humbly to the ground. She wasn't really responsible for this situation, and yet she calls herself David's servant. Truly wise in that action, And David takes notice. That wisdom was enough to change his heart. As we see by his words, he says, "Now praise to the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you today to me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands." David doesn't get defensive. He doesn't bring back that rage, strapping on his sword and going off to battle. He actually thanks the Lord, and he's happy that Abigail came to him and even showed that what he was doing was a sin. You can see that by what he says, what's going on in his heart has changed. No longer is he overbearing, no longer is he scared. He's confident, he's confessing his sin, and he's going forward. The story concludes in verse 36. When Abigail went to Nabal afterwards, he was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until daybreak. And then in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things, and his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. The interesting part about how this story ends is that Nabal had enough luxury to throw a feast like that of a king, even after Abigail had brought those supplies to David. It appears the guy who couldn't show anybody any grace, well, he finally gets his time of grace taken. 1 Samuel 25 is an interesting chapter, and these characters, I wonder, how many of them relate to you? Not that you would point out into your life those Nabals that you run into, but those times when you find yourself like Nabal, hard-hearted or selfish, or like Abigail, wise and sacrificial, or like David, reactive and ready to argue, or like David, humble enough to be corrected. Friends, if you're listening to this, well, there's time to take this lesson to heart. Time for you to confess your sin to God, to come clean to people you might have offended when you flew off the handle. Time enough to hear him say to you one more time, "I forgive you. I forgive you. I have heaven prepared for you. I love you." Take that to heart. Fill your heart with those things. Fill your head with that thought, so that when you're bumped in everyday life, those other things wouldn't come out anymore, but instead, you would show that same kind of grace and care to the people around you. Because Abigail, she was a woman of wisdom. Wise, truly wise, because she feared the Lord and she knew him. And you saw it in how she lived and what she said. So also you, when you come here for worship, you're filling your heart with good things, that those same good things would come out of you. Now, I know I've mentioned this passage several times, but I haven't given you opportunity to read it. Would you read this with me on the screen one time? From the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Consider this week what's in your heart and what you'd like to get off your heart to the Lord. Consider what the Lord has done in your heart by calling you to faith, by forgiving you, by loving you. And let that flow out of you in your words. Amen.